The Boy Who Lived by Louise Charlton. Chapter 4. Remembrance. As Harry followed the line of witches and wizards making their way to the Burrow illuminated by moonlight, he realized just how ill-dressed they all were. Most of the younger people had at least managed normal Muggle dress, but some of the older wizards wore rather bizarre pairings of night-dresses and Wellington boots or boiler suits and baseball caps. The older they were, the worse they seemed to be, except for McGonagall, who wore a crisp, short-sleeved navy jacket with a white blouse and a navy tartan skirt. Harry had to suppress a giggle at the bizarre sight, and was thankful for the lack of light that shielded his face from view whilst walking along the windy lane out of the village, lost in the large crowd of curious-looking people who were getting excited over small things such as the parked cars outside houses, especially those illuminated by multicoloured lights from televisions. Harry looked out for Ginny, but with such a vast crowd of mismatched members of the wizarding population all around him, it was impossible to find her. By the time Harry arrived at the Burrow, there were already crowds of people gathered in the tent waiting for everyone else to arrive. Taking the opportunity, Harry greeted Kingsley Shacklebolt, who was now a very busy man and so wouldn't be staying long. Then Daedalus Diggle popped up, surprising Harry. He had not expected to see him here. Harry expressed this, and Daedalus replied, "Well, your aunt, uncle and cousin were very eager to get back. I delivered the news about you-know-who to them as soon as I heard myself. They then requested we take them back home as soon as possible, once we could be sure that no Death Eaters would target them in revenge. I hear from old Mrs. Figger that they've settled back in well." Whilst Harry didn't want to discuss the Dursleys, he was pleased to know that they were back at Privet Drive, back to their boring normality. But was there normality to return to? Harry wondered. Could Vernon still work at Grunnings, or was he now despicably unemployed? Was Dudley going to finish school, or remain a dropout? And how would Petunia possibly manage being the talk of the neighbourhood following their inconspicuous absence for a year? Whilst Harry's guilt was limited due to his feelings towards the Dursleys, he still felt responsible. This was perhaps because he had felt responsible for all of the victims from the recent war over the last few weeks. And as Vernon had reminded him on the day of their parting, all the Dursleys had done was harbour a wanted man. "Unwillingly," Harry added, feeling bitter about what they had put him through for the best part of 16 years. "It's not my fault," Harry repeated continuously in his head. Harry had not chosen to become orphaned and wanted by the most powerful dark wizard to have ever lived, stuck with an abusive family and constantly having to run from death. Harry would have loved a happy life with his parents, free from danger, with a godfather who had lived a free man. Of course it was not his fault. And yet it was. But Harry's guilty thoughts were cut short by the arrival of George and Mrs. Weasley, as Mr. Weasley could now hover glasses of fire whiskey to everyone for a toast to Fred's memory. Kingsley quickly drained his glass before excusing himself, needing to get back to the ministry. The celebration continued well into the night, with hordes of witches and wizards gathered to remember Fred. George and Ginny had retreated back to the house unnoticed by the guests, who were immersed in their memories of Fred. Once Harry saw Ron leave the tent, he noticed a lack of Weasleys. Harry realised that they no longer dominated the dwindling congregation. Bill and Fleur, it transpired, had crept out shortly after 10 p.m, with Percy following shortly after that. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley had also gone to bed in this time, leaving just Charlie representing the family. But he didn't seem to mind, as he was happily sharing anecdotes from his childhood, proudly admitting that they gave their mother more than her fair share of trouble. Harry decided to follow Ron out of the tent, seeing an opportunity to settle things with him once and for all. After all, Fred would never have held a grudge, regardless of how much he may have teased Ron and driven him crazy. Fred's dealings with Percy were proof of that. Harry was proud to have known Fred, and now wanted to honour his memory in the best way possible. Harry crept through the kitchen on tiptoe, working his way towards the hall and up the stairs, careful not to creak a floorboard for fear of waking people up. But after he had ascended 2 flights of stairs and was tiptoeing along the corridor to the next one, he heard a noise which made him forget all about his destination. It was crying, coming from George's room. Harry crept up to the door and leant forward until his face was barely an inch away from it, and quietly called out, "George, are you all right?" The sobbing continued, but it now sounded as if there were 2 pairs of eyes shedding tears. Harry tentatively lifted his arm up and pushed on the door. It was difficult to make out the shapes in the dark room, but once his eyes had adjusted to the poor light, Harry could see the figures of George and Ginny, curled up in a narrow single bed, weeping into each other. And then Harry saw Ginny's eyes looking directly at him, catching a sliver of moonlight poking up from the bottom window-sill and shining directly onto the left side of Ginny's face, clearly reflecting the deep sadness in her eyes, which were once again red and puffy. Feeling like an intruder on a very personal gathering of which he was not invited, Harry stammered, "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was on my way up to Ron's room, to try and sort things out, and I heard crying." And as Harry turned around to leave, Ginny grabbed his hand. Harry froze, startled by the sudden movement, before allowing Ginny to lead him back to the bed, where George had already sat up and created a space for Harry to join them. On close inspection George looked sorrowful, his eyes robbed of their usual sparkle, and without his mischievous grin Harry thought that George looked much too old. He had been aged by the tragedy of war. Harry choked back the tears, struggling to speak the words in his mind out loud. But George placed a gentle hand on Harry's shoulder and communicated everything to Harry without a word. Only then did Harry know that he shouldn't blame himself for Fred's death. George didn't. It had seemed like several hours that the trio had spent laughing, crying and smiling whilst remembering Fred, the mastermind behind some of the twins' finest hours. Having someone to share the sorrow with was soothing for them. Harry now felt strangely relaxed, and Ginny began yawning more frequently. "Come on, Ginny, time for bed," Harry gently remarked, lightly gripping her arm and leading her to the door, looking over to George to try and communicate his intentions to him. George gave a brief nod and a small smile as Harry walked with Ginny out of the door. "Oh, before you go, can I ask you something?" George called out to Harry. "Sure," he replied. "Ask away." "Well, you know you've died," George began hesitantly. "Yeah," Harry replied, trying to work out where this was going. "Well, I was wondering, do you think Freddie was in pain? Does it hurt?" George finished, in this moment looking younger than ever, almost childlike. Harry thought for a few moments as George waited with bated breath. "No, it's quicker and easier than falling asleep," Harry answered with a small smile before bidding George good night and leading a sleepy Ginny down the corridor and back to her room. Once Harry was out of sight, George pulled out a thin, string-like cord from around his neck and lifted a small black clock hand right up to his lips. He whispered, "Good night, Freddie," before stowing the hand away again and pulling the covers back, crawling into bed feeling exhausted but strangely peaceful. His heart was no longer mindlessly beating, with a gradual warmth permeating through it. Harry knocked softly on Ginny's bedroom door before calling out to Hermione in a whisper, but there was no response. Creeping very quietly into the room, Harry realised that it was empty. Ginny concluded that Hermione was up in Ron's room giving Ginny some privacy, and was maybe keeping an eye on Ron in the process. Harry made a mental note to thank Hermione in the morning. Ginny crawled into bed and her eyes were heavy as she looked up at Harry, a panicked expression spread across her face. "Please stay," she asked Harry as he pulled the covers over her. He leant down towards Ginny and lightly brushed her forehead with his lips. "Always," he whispered, before sitting on the edge of the bed and stroking her hair gently, soothing her until he was satisfied that she was soundly asleep. He then leant forward and whispered in her ear softly, "You know where I am if you need me," pecked her lightly on the cheek, and then gently slid off the bed and crept out of the room as silently as possible. Now back in Percy's room, Harry dressed in silence. Exhausted from the day's events, Harry was too drained to even check the time. He knew it was late, but it was still very dark outside. The summer sun was not due to make an appearance quite yet. Contemplating another disturbed night, Harry flopped in bed, barely managing to remove his glasses and place them on the bedside cabinet. But to his surprise, sleep welcomed him like an old friend, and for what seemed like the first time in forever, Harry had pleasant dreams, not fraught with nightmare or terror, but pure happiness. He dreamt of Tun-Tung toffees, toilet seats, miraculous fireworks, and, somewhere in the distance, the hazy figures of two redheads flying on brooms hitting bludgers. Just a few short hours later, Harry was awoken by a loud crack. Creature was right on schedule. Harry had asked him to wake him just after dawn. Creature padded over to Harry's bedside and shook him firmly until Harry blearily blinked and grinned at Creature, thanking him for the wake-up call. As his hand found his glasses and he put them on his face, Creature vanished with another loud crack. Harry dressed in silence, gradually waking up from his contented sleep, trying to remember the last time he had slept that well, and wondered if it would continue into another night. Deep in thought, Harry crept out of Percy's room and across the landing towards the stairs. As he passed Ginny's room, he pushed the door open slightly and tiptoed over the threshold to check on her. He watched for a while as she slept, mesmerised by the halo of bright sunlight illuminating her head, making her look angelic, casting a warm glow around the room. A sudden movement of her eyelids briefly startled him, but when her irises burned in on him, his heart melted, seeing the fear and pain etched on her pale face. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she croaked, "Please don't go." He had to stay. There was no way he could possibly leave now. He paced over to her bed and lay beside her, soothing her to sleep again. He noticed that Hermione was still absent and involuntarily smiled, thinking about how brilliant she really was. He loved Hermione, of course, but only ever as a friend, and also like a sister. His stomach remained perfectly still when he was near her, and his breath never left him when she caught his eye. She was only a good friend, and certainly not the only woman who had been willing to die for him. And before he knew it, his vision had blurred as he thought of his mother, who had not been much older than he was now, when she stood between him and Voldemort, pleading for his life to be spared. "Pull yourself together," Harry told himself angrily. Harry had stayed a while after Ginny's breathing deepened to ensure that she was definitely asleep, before creeping downstairs to the kitchen, where Mrs. Weasley was poised over the stove preparing breakfast. "Morning, Mrs. Weasley," Harry called out, announcing his presence. He figured that after having so many children, not much startled her any more, as she casually responded over her shoulder, "Good morning, Harry dear. I trust you slept well." She then turned around to observe Harry, and her kindly expression was riddled with concern. Coming to the conclusion that he must look a right state, Harry replied, "Yes, thanks. I'm heading off to the Ministry early, 'cause there's something I need to discuss with Kingsley before we go and engrave the new memorials. I'm doing Remus, Tonks and Colin Creevy's names." Harry wanted to ensure that he was not adding more worry for Mrs. Weasley about his sleep patterns. "How nice of you to do that, dear," she replied, not looking entirely convinced that Harry had slept. In a bid to ease the tension, she then added, "I'll just whip something up for you quickly before you go." She then summoned sausages, bacon and eggs and expertly conducted the kitchen with her wand. Harry knew better than to refuse, and so took a seat at the table, taking in the delicious smells wafting around the room, making him feel sleepy. He was roused only by the sudden arrival of a plate of cooked breakfast and a basket of bread rolls. He ravenously devoured the meal quickly, not realizing how hungry he was. But not wishing to delay any longer, he made for the back door before he could be served seconds, waving good-bye as he stepped out of the door and into the rapidly rising sun. Suddenly remembering something, Harry turned around and ran back up the path, poking his head around the kitchen door and calling out to Mrs. Weasley to not worry about George and Ginny. They had had a late night and just needed to sleep. Harry had not lingered long at the Burrow, running straight for the border and apparating to London, where he swiftly made his way through the shoppers to the Ministry of Magic. As he stepped into the phone box and the cool, clear voice welcomed him to the Ministry of Magic, Harry shuddered, remembering his fateful trip here with Dumbledore's army, that had ultimately resulted in the death of his godfather and started the Second Wizarding War. Harry tried to put the memory to the back of his mind. Harry pinned on his visitor's badge, stating that he was Harry Potter, Memorial Volunteer, as the lift sank down to the atrium several floors below. As the doors of the lift slid open, Harry looked on at a distantly familiar sight. The watch wizard Eric was present like before, and the walls of the atrium were still lined with fireplaces, but it looked unnervingly bland without the glistening of the fountain or the overbearing black stone statue that had previously dominated the room, declaring that magic is might. All that stood in the middle of the polished wooden floor now was a short, square pillar made of lightly coloured concrete, decorated with what looked like a floral pattern. However, on closer inspection, Harry discovered that the pattern was formed from several names in small, ornamented print joined together to form a chain. He was reminded of the artwork on Luna Lovegood's bedroom ceiling. And as Harry was perusing the names on the memorial, recognizing them as victims of the First Wizarding War, a slow, deep voice called out to Harry from over his left shoulder, "Do you like what we've done so far?" "We'll have the victims of the Second Wizarding War on the other side," Kingsley added as he strode over to Harry, who suddenly felt very guilty at disturbing the minister. But when Harry voiced his apology, Kingsley cut him short, his reassuring voice telling Harry not to worry about it. "I came in early today to do some paperwork, but it wasn't exactly going well, so when the alarms went off I fancied a walk," he said. And on seeing Harry's blank expression, he explained, "Since there are still quite a few Death Eaters roaming around who know where we are, I figured a little extra security wouldn't go amiss." "Anyway, Potter, why so early? We're not starting till 9:30, Kingsley added. "Well, I was wondering if I could have a word with you about a few things before the others get here," Harry nervously replied. "Sure, follow me," Kingsley responded, heading for the golden gates that Harry knew led to the lifts.